So welcome. If you're just tuning in, we're going to wait a couple of minutes to see if we have a few more participants join. So I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. My name is Andrea Whiteley. I'll just quickly introduce myself as people are joining, and then we can introduce the other panelists. Incidentally, I am fulfilling two roles today. I am a panelist slash presenter. I will be joining Chloe Atkins just for a couple of slides of a presentation we developed jointly and some work we're doing. So I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the PROUD project at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. My background is actually in communications, and I have a PhD in communication, University of Calgary. My dissertation research focused on enabling research access for people outside of academia in the public. So I'm very passionate about knowledge mobilization and access to research. But I'm working with Chloe on this 3-year SSHRC project. We'll tell you a bit more about that as her postdoctoral fellow. And I'm also a caregiver person with a degenerative neurological illness. So I have a personal and professional interest in what's going on at this Disability and Work Conference. I will start by introducing our panelists today. Our first presentation will be from Christine Morin. She is a researcher and development manager. Christine has been teaching psychosocial intervention at Cégep de Vieux Montréal in the Department of Special Care Counseling for over 15 years. She's been a researcher in the field of inclusion since 2015, and she's interested in a variety of topics tied to inclusion, namely inclusive education in post-secondary institutions, inclusive practices, and employment of people experiencing disability and reflexive professional development towards inclusion. Helen Grantis will also be one of our presenters, and she is a consultant with the Public Service Commission of Canada. Helen is a specialist in accessible and inclusive assessment and staffing at the Personnel Psychology Center. Helen has over 15 years experience, and she's been working within the fields of disability accommodation, accessibility, and diversity inclusion. She's advised managers, human resource advisors, and job applicants to ensure a more inclusive and barrier-free hiring process. And she's been part of the accessibility task team at the Employment and Social Development Canada and consulted on the Accessible Canada Act. And then Chloe Atkins, who is my supervisor and boss, is a primary investigator at an associate professor status only at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Chloe has research interests in disability, bioethics, vulnerable minority identities, human rights, phenomenological research, and narrative scholarship. Atkins holds a PhD in political science, in political theory, and a postdoctorate from Cornell University, where she was working in feminist legal jurisprudence. Dr. Atkins is the author of My Imaginary Illness, published in 2011 and awarded 3 prizes, including the American Journal of Nursing's Book of the Year. So I think we can get started now with Christine's presentation.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you great. And you'll be sharing your screen?
Absolutely. Okay, thanks so much. So my name is Christine Morin, and I will be presenting in English as a choice, because I could have been presenting in French. So please forgive my English if it's not perfectly perfect. I'm a researcher at the CRISPECH, the Center for Research on Inclusion of People in Disabling Situations. We mostly work in Montreal at the moment, and we mostly work in French. So I will share my screen right now and present. I'm here today on behalf of CRISPECH to present you a guide and a tool that we developed over the past year called Incluvis, that is aiming at supporting organizations for the employment of people in disabling situations. What we've found is that the employability of persons in disabling situation is currently of particular interest to employers because of the context of manpower scarcity, the context of increasing EDI initiatives in the workplace, but we also noticed in our contact with employers that employers can feel easily overwhelmed and ill-equipped to address the question of inclusion of people in disabling situation in the workplace. So we developed Incluvis in partnership to help organizations become more inclusive in the employability of persons in disabling situations. I will be presenting the guide and the tool today. I want to start with a little note on terminology. Incluvis was first created in French and will be in the process of being translated very soon in English. We use in French the term personne en situation de handicap. And we've did our best to use the terminology from the Human Development Model disability creation process. That is a social model of disability formulated by Patrick Fouguerolas, which is a Quebec researcher and university professor. And we are using the terminology persons in disabling situation to explicitly refer to this conceptual model. We are open, we had long conversation about the right terminology in English, and we are opening, not today, the discussion, but if you're ever interested, let us know. We have a vivid interest in this. So, Incluvis is, as I said, both a guide and a self-diagnostic tool to help organizations. It's for medium or small size organizations like businesses, municipality, community organizations. And we're offering the guide, obviously, to anyone, the tool and the guide, but it's aiming at those responsible for HR, human resources policies, and EDI community members as well within different organizations. It was born from a partnership we had at CRISPECH, our research center, with the ROSEF, which is regrouping specialized services who have for a mission to promote integration and inclusion for people with disabilities. So we worked together, and this is the development process we used. We first built an experts committee with different experts in the field of employment for people in disabling situations. And we completed through an iterative process, the first version that was released last winter 2021. We then put together the advisory committee with people from workplace organization to get feedback on the use of the tool and the guide. We then use their graphic designer to help us finalize the second version, which is gonna launch very soon, either right before Christmas or when we come back from the holidays. So I'll present the guide, and I'll give you I'll present you the tool after, the self-diagnostic tool. The few objectives of the guide are raising awareness, that's the first one, among organizations about the inclusion of people in disabling situation by providing a starting point for thinking about and implementing an approach to this effect. We also aim to support the initiation of a change process within the organization, the ultimate outcomes of which could lead in the future in the development of an inclusion policy. The third objective is to situate the organization with respect to the gap to be addressed between the current practices and the desired practices within the organization, and inform the organization by referring it to a variety of available resources. We set the guide in 6 different sections. The first one is to provide a common ground in terms of terminology. So it's understand the concepts of person in disabling situations and the concept of inclusion. The second section of the guide is to discover the facilitating factors for inclusion. The third section, evaluate the progress of the organization, is really the tool that I'll be presenting in 1 minute, the self-diagnostic tool. The fourth section is learn about current terminology. We'll be offering a glossary to help organization leaders and community members to understand better the terminology. The fifth section is get informed and take action, and the sixth section, develop an inclusion policy. So I'm coming to the tool now. I want to stay within my minutes. The objective of the self-diagnostic tool is called Incluvis as well, and the idea is that the guide informs how we're going to take the tool and reflect upon the practices we want to change. But they can be obviously used separately at separate times. The objectives of the tool to allow time for reflection on current practices within the organization, provide avenues for further reflection and action for the development of inclusive employability practices, orient the prioritization of the organization over the short term, and an informed decision-making for the medium and long term. What we did is that we divided the tool in 5 different sections, and each section has 10 questions each. You'll see that it's divided in the progression in terms of employment as well. So the first section pertains to the place of people in disabling situation in the workforce within the organization. It's sort of like trying to get a snapshot. Second section is recruitment and selection, trying to provide good questions to bring insight on the practices and how to become a bit more inclusive within these sectors. The third section, welcome and integration. How can we reflect and improve the practices when new employees come in? Employment retention is section 4. It relates to development, professional development and skill enhancing in the workforce. And the 5th section is on working condition, everything that has to do with either accommodation, scheduling, safety practices that could be more inclusive for people in disabling situations within the workplace. So I'll give you a little snapshot so you can see the tool itself. It's in French. So a couple of things before I show you an example. The sections they all relate to a stage of employment, and each section is self-supporting and therefore can be used independently. So this means that organizations could decide that they prioritize for a year to work on recruitment and selection, and they want to be more inclusive in that area. And the next year, they can take another section of the tool to improve in a different area. And you'll see I'll be presenting you the scale that we used. So each question is assessed according to evolving progress markers. So we decided to, when we thought about the scale, we decided to go with a growth mindset. So it means that we want to encourage employers to get involved, and we know it takes courage to bring change and to bring change in terms of inclusive practices. Some employers feel they don't know, and it's a bit of a scary place to investigate. So we really want to make this a positive change. And sometimes we don't take action, but we have initiated something, and that's already something to celebrate and to underline. So this is the scale, and I'll be freely translating right now. So 0% means not yet. We haven't yet had the time to think about it, and we haven't initiated anything to that effect. The second is 1 to 25%. We're thinking about it. We have prioritized this aspect within our organizations. We started a reflection to that effect. 26 to 50% we're planning. So we have started planning and taken action on the matter. 51 to 75% we're implementing. We're in the process of implementation. 76 to 99% we are almost towards appropriation. Our teams have integrated different ways of working, different principles in terms of inclusive practices in their day-to-day. And 100% that we are there. We have institutionalized practices within our organizations. So that's a little bit of the scale that we're suggesting to use for the tool. The first section here is this is just an example. It's not. I took examples in French. So the first section is on people in disabling situation within the workforce, actually in the organization. And so you can see this is an interactive PDF, and we do encourage that people who do fill this tool within the organization share it with other team members, management team. So it's easy to send by email and add little notes on where we're at and the initiatives we're taking or the reflections we have on a topic. So the second, this is an example of the fourth section, which is employment retention. And you can see there's 10 questions per section, as I said before. Information, like the first question here, information on support measures and resources available to people with persons in disabling situations in our organization is systematically transferred and accessible. So the person can use the scale and decide whether they're at 0, not there yet, or 25%, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the 5th. So for each section, there's a different color. And then we do offer an interactive priority grid. So we encourage organizations to choose 1 or 2 priority section. And within these sections, to choose 1 or 2 questions on which they want to work in order not to be overwhelmed and to go slowly but surely towards inclusive practices in terms of employability. So this is my conclusion. I hope I'm not too far in the 10 minutes. And so in a nutshell, Incluvis is to promote proactive change and employability practices for inclusion of people in disabling situation in the workplace. Thank you very much. I feel like I've run a little marathon.
No, that was amazing. I have lots of questions myself, but we'll get to that hopefully soon. No worries, going a couple minutes over. We're still within lots of time. So thanks very much, Christine. We'll now welcome Helen Grantis to give us our next presentation, please.
Great, thanks, Andrea, and thank you, Christina. I'm really enjoy hearing about those really concrete, solid tools that are going to be available to employers. Thanks for that. So I'm here from the Public Service Commission of Canada. Let me just pull up my slide here. So I'm here from the Public Service Commission of Canada, and I just wanted to join the conversation because I'm really happy to be part of this community, and I'm really happy to be part of the initiatives going on in the public service and across Canada in support of the Accessible Canada Act and in support of inclusive staffing and recruitment and hiring. I've been in this area for a while with respect to providing accommodations in the assessment phase of the staffing process. So I've seen the ups and downs in this area within the federal public service with respect to improvements that are needed to inclusion and really understanding what that means to be inclusive and to remove barriers. So and this is along the lines, with respect to what Yasmin Laroche believe she was here yesterday, and she was talking to you about the accessible public service strategy, which is a really important strategy with this respect. And the Public Service Commission, our really important mandate is to remove barriers in the staffing process and to try to support employers and organizations within the federal government to do that. As you know, the federal government is a very large employer, and there's a lot of different departments and there's a lot of initiatives going on. So the PPC where I work, the Personnel Psychology Center, is a pretty small space, small unit, but we are trying to get some services and some initiatives in place to really get this message across beyond accommodation, and we're looking more into the accessibility and the inclusion area. So this is just a good graphic, and for those of you who can't see it, this is just a representation visually of what we mean between the differences between accommodation and accessibility. And this is something that is sort of a concept that we're trying to ensure that managers and HR advisors are understanding more, because as we know with the Accessible Canada Act and other accessibility acts across the country, we want to ensure that we're looking at inclusion first and we're looking at accessibility first. Accommodation is a very important aspect of this, absolutely, and it is something that managers have become more familiar with. But so this picture does depict accommodation and what it really means with respect to an individual having to ask for access to something because they don't normally have access. So this is depicting a person trying to access a whiteboard. and there's 3 people standing around the whiteboard, and they all can't reach. So the people who can't reach it are requiring accommodations, and they do have to ask for those accommodations. As opposed to the second graphic, which depicts a person, 3 people standing in front of a whiteboard, and the whiteboard's been lowered, it's at their level, it's accessible to them. And this has been done prior to them even being in front of the whiteboard. So they have access, they didn't have to ask for access. So that's the kind of mindset that we're trying to move forward with the Accessible Canada Act and within staffing and assessment in the public service. So really trying to look at your assessment tools and your processes from an inclusion and accessibility standpoint first, and not having to wait for someone, a candidate or someone, to come to you and require, ask for accommodations, I should say. So some of the things that managers and HR advisors want to know is, okay, we hear about these barriers, we hear about them, but we don't really know what you mean. What are the barriers with respect to assessment? So briefly, I think, again, I really like the concrete information. So I really like people to understand what that looks like from a concrete perspective. So this image basically depicts a series of ladders. And I use the ladders because I feel when I listen to people describe trying to get accommodations or trying to, write an assessment or be a part of a process, there seems to be a bit of a climb and there's barriers in place. So this ladder depicts the barriers that are in place at different steps of the assessment process. And so each rung potentially is a barrier. And so those barriers can be things like access skills. So what are the skills that a person needs to actually be able to demonstrate the competency? And the competency or the ability or the knowledge is the target skill. So what do the person, to actually demonstrate that, they have to climb the ladder and go past a few of these barriers. And as we might know, there are assessment tools, interviews, written tests, things like that are notoriously designed very similarly. People generally have to be able to read or write or communicate in some orally. And if not, well, it's going to be potentially be a challenge. So if there are any difficulties or if there are any disabilities that are preventing people from demonstrating those access skills, and of course, it's going to be a challenge for them to demonstrate the target skill. So, and this is a concept, I think, because many of these assessment tools are designed to be provided, to people who may not have these access skill challenges, they're overlooked. So there's lots of assumptions about what people can or cannot do. And in fact, we are very diverse with respect to what our abilities are and what our disabilities are. So this is highlighting the fact that when you do consider an assessment tool, or when you do consider assessing individuals from the diversity of groups in Canada, you want to make sure that you think about what are the skills they actually need to show me what they can do on the job. And how to do that, trying to emphasize to managers and to HR advisors that there are ways that you can design your assessment tools that follow along with certain principles that may be more familiar with to this group with respect to universal design of spaces. And we've taken that concept to universal design of assessment. And this is a concept that's been thought of for a while in the educational sphere, but now we're taking it more into the workplace perspective, the workplace milieu. And essentially what we're talking about is, if you don't have an accessible assessment tool, then the person is not going to be able to demonstrate their competency. It's plain and simple. So you want to design your assessment tools so they are inclusive and accessible to as many people as you can, but there's always going to be a target audience, which is also important because you want to think about who is that target audience and how might they be impacted. So these are things as simple as making sure that you use plain language, making sure that you have a clear layout and it's readable, that people are able to see what is it that they need to do. What do they have to demonstrate to you? Do they have to summarize something? Do they have to answer multiple choice questions? Do they have to respond to an oral question? And then clear and simple instructions. how do I do this? What's the task? And these are the kind of things that really come up a lot. And I've been doing this work for a long time and looking at assessment tools and seeing some of the barriers. And there are many times where I have trouble understanding what's required. And these are assessments that are potentially for people who, may even have more trouble because of a disability or some other barrier that's in place. So it's really important to recognize that when you're writing these assessment tools, that there are many different perspectives and diversities who are going to be consuming this information. So the other part of this is that they're also easily adaptable. So it's okay to make a version of a test in one way or an interview, but when you do that, think about other ways you could redevelop it to make it more accessible for someone who requires accommodations, or if there needs to be some kind of modification to the setting, the timing, things like that. So, so having a question bank, having things in sections that you can move around or take out or provide breaks or make longer or shorter, things like that. And then, of course, using non-biased language, considering who your audience is. So those are really they're fundamental, but they're really important basic best practices. And then on top of that, of course, I think maybe the most important one is that make sure you're assessing what your job was required for your job. So what are the essential requirements? And make sure your questions ask those questions. And then that way you can get a good sample of the individual who you're asking the question, so they can demonstrate to you what their capacity is. And the more closely related those questions are to the actual tasks in the workplace, the better. Then you can provide accommodations in the test, and you can really match up that job sample or that task with the actual job in question. So that's the message that my unit at the PPC, and I know across the government as well, we have a network of individuals who are also really trying to understand how to be more inclusive to people with disabilities. Right now, the Personnel Psychology Center is running a network of accessible assessment ambassadors, which we provide these best practices. We have meetings to discuss situations, just to have a reach out point for any of these challenging situations that we might come across within the government. So I think that's all I wanted to say about that, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen. I loved your graphics, and that was a really great presentation, focusing on a lot of things that employers can do. Again, I'm so looking forward to our discussion afterwards, because I have lots of things that I would like to ask you about your tools that you're creating as well. So now our third presentation will be Chloe Atkins and myself for a couple of those slides. And so we'll welcome Chloe, Dr. Chloe Atkins at the University of Toronto, and I will be sharing our slides as well.
Hi, my name's Chloe Atkins, and I'm the lead researcher of the PROUD project at the University of Toronto. We titled our talk "The Secret Sauce to Improving Employment Outcomes for Persons with Disabilities." Next slide.
Oops.
How I decided to do this was that I have a disability myself, and I became really acutely aware over the course of my career that when somebody is obviously disabled, I often masked my disability because I could, but when someone can't mask or cover their disability, as at certain times that was true for me, that you couldn't get a job. I couldn't get employed. And then at the very same employer, when I looked able-bodied, I got a job. And so it became, I felt it palpably, and the statistics show that despite the fact that we have lots of liberal democracies have passed legislation that are mandating workplace accommodations and trying to encourage inclusion, that there's still quite low rates of employment for people with disabilities. But I decided that I didn't want to look at what were the barriers, because I think we know what those are. What I wanted to do was speak to people who've been successful despite the barriers, and to speak to people who employed individuals with disabilities. So that's essentially that's one of our major projects at the PROUD project, and that's where it all started. Do you want to do the next slide, Andrea?
Yeah.
You're going to do this.
Yeah, so sorry, thank you. So just a quick overview of the research that we've been working on as part of the PROUD project. The main project involves interviewing people living with disabilities who are in the workforce, as well as employers who are creating inclusive workplaces for people with disabilities. And so we have completed a number of interviews in Canada, and now we're expanding to the US, the UK, France, and Belgium. So we've also completed a comprehensive literature review in the area of disability and employment. And this has been a really interesting project that evaluated 1,200 published research articles just to get an understanding of the kind of research that's happening. We're also working on a podcast series in cooperation with Easter Seals Canada, and it's called Broadcastability. We've produced 3 podcasts so far, and in French and English. And we're dropping one a month. So we'll have about 8 by the end of the project. And hopefully we'll be able to continue with our podcast production as we go along. And, you know, these podcasts are actually interviews with our research participants, and they're like an innovative way of knowledge mobilization of research. So this has been really, really great for us, really interesting, and a good way for our participants to share their experiences with a broader public than, you know, might be accessible or being able to access a journal article reporting on our research. And so finally, we're teaching a 4th-year undergrad course where we'll be exploring research ethics in the context of working with disabled and deaf communities. And this course is going to be fully accessible. And we're collaborating with 3 colleagues at the University of Manchester to teach it as a hybrid course.
Okay, just as there was one thing we skipped there, we're also doing work around what disability can offer, particularly to medical practice and bioethics, particularly in the period of the triaging during the pandemic. This is sort of the slide that's going to preoccupy most amount of time. Now, I'd love to say that I have the secret sauce, but I'm going to try and summarize what we found by speaking to employees and employers in Canada. And I'll be really clear that we do not speak to employers of the people that we speak to when they are employees. Okay, but we also speak to entrepreneurs, but we wanted to be clearly separate so that people could speak in confidentiality and that they felt they could speak in confidentiality. The first of these is that there is sometimes a difference and sometimes ideas are parallel about how you bring about inclusion in the workplace. The first of these, what employees really notice, and I think is true, is that that diversity and inclusion is driven from the top, that organizations that have policies, but also that their leaders behave in certain ways, in inclusive ways, are really the ones that seem to be the most successful in bringing, truly integrating disabled individuals in the workplace. What we have found, there is a formal understanding of the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA, as well as Accessibility Canada and Charter Rights and Human Rights, employment equity legislation. But at times there is not fully an understanding of the drive that needs to come from the top, that there needs to be an immersive sense of culture about diversity. With regard for tools for success, what employers see, and I think the other 2 presenters have said this really, really well, is that they are individualized. These are accommodations that people ask for, and they're provided on an individual basis. The ones that seem to be, that's how employers see it, and employees who are successful in the workplace see it as sort of much broader. First of all, we really noticed how they relied on IT a great deal for solutions, for IT hardware and applications. But they push things along further. The most successful and inclusive workplaces were ones that had made sure that their purchasing policies actually were in line with their desire to accommodate and to be, that were universally designed and were going to fit with the IT tools that individuals with disabilities used in their organization. And that those tools and those software were continually updated, because this meant that people were able to be most productive. So that things like also universally designing spaces, a push button on a door doesn't just helps somebody in a wheelchair or someone who's weak. It helps somebody who's carrying heavy equipment or moving large items through an organization. There are all sorts of reasons that we have it's a universal design rather than an individually accommodated design. If we move down to the issue around disclosure, this is one of the sort of interesting things. Employers want to know, because at some level they want to know that they are in fact checking the boxes for diversity, but also if they're actually going to undertake something like what Christine is doing, that they're moving along the trajectory that they want to, that they are in fact interviewing and perhaps also hiring at increasing levels over time people with disabilities. The problem with that is there's a combination of anxiety and openness that employees feel. First of all, it's illegal to ask personal questions in interviews about such things, so that is a barrier. But even in interviews, those who've been in careers longest were really savvy that they needed somehow in the interviews to allay certain fears. If they were quadriplegic, or if they were deaf, or they were blind, they needed to demonstrate in some way that they had already problem solved how they managed their lives, their working lives. And in that sense, there is this very delicate balance that needs to be walked between disclosure and not disclosing, because they didn't want to leave the interview with unanswered questions that actually could have, they could answer those questions so that they would be considered on the par with somebody who didn't have a disability. Now, with regard to flexibility and productivity, I actually think there is a parallelism here that both employees and employers want to be productive. Employers want their employees to be productive, and employees want to be productive. But that employees see sort of a flexibility and, again, universal design and accommodation, things like, and this is the culture from the top that I'm going to talk about, that it just becomes commonplace. It is policy and carried out that all internal documentation is accessible. That just makes sure that everybody does it. It's not a single thing. So that means that it's a much more flexible, every document doesn't have to be redone or re-looked at for someone with a disability. It just is. Flexibility around working hours, that to some extent has been proven by the pandemic to be possible. Flexibility in working arrangements from working from home. Everybody thought productivity would fall off. It didn't. So in fact, I think that I'm hoping, and I think people we spoke to seem to be hopeful, that there was this window of opportunity that the pandemic had offered about showing how flexible arrangements could actually allow workplaces still to be productive, but also meet the needs of employees. The other thing that we were really interested in, and employees spoke of this, employers, in their effort to be diverse, many employer groups had gotten diversity sort of committees together in the workplaces. Now, they could have been dealt with around indigeneity or gender or race. One of the issues around disability was that there were a lot of people in the workplace who are masking their disabilities or covering them, and so don't want to step up into these committees because it would be out. I'm running late. Okay, I'm almost done. They would be outed and seen to be disabled, and they didn't want to be. The other part of this is almost all of these groups were unpaid. They were done off company time, and yet they were meant to be influencing how the workplace was structured. And this, to me, and to some of these individuals, felt as though, once again, disabled individuals were being asked for their expertise, but not actually being compensated in it in sort of a consulting manner. And I think that's something we need to think about it. The last three are sort of all across I think are together in the sense it goes back to the culture, is that it's a universal, not a single accommodation on an individual basis. Yes, you're going to have to do that for certain people who have specific disabilities, but if you universally design things from the outset and it permeates the whole organization, that's much better. It's better than just checking the box. You need to have not just HR interested in bringing diversity hires, but everybody throughout the organization starts to understand what that means, and that instead of seeing disability as a deficit or something that has to be overcome, that actually it's seen as a valued skill set that people, I'm going to go to the next two slides quickly, Andrea. I'm just here with that, people we discover with employees that they have a lot of education, they're great, very self-aware, they're highly resourceful and experienced problem solvers, they're flexible and adaptable in the workplace, they're very persistent and resilient, and they have very strong social networks. And next slide, and then I'll leave the last two for Andrea. And what we found, the most successful workplaces had robust IT resources, that ongoing support, and they were very aware of it, that accommodations or universal design benefits everybody. And then we can talk about this in the questions about how it's not just up to the employer if they support broader social policies that will make their work environments more diverse and accessible.
If you can just bring my video back. So just really quickly, obviously to push this metaphor of the secret sauce to even further, the key to an inclusive workplace involves the full meal deal. It's not just employers that are responsible for creating a really inclusive environment, and it's not just the employees for doing all the right things. It's lots of other groups. And this is maybe a little bit self-evident, but because our panel focused on what employers can do and employer tools and the responsibility of employers, we thought it was important that we just point out that the government plays a huge role in terms of being responsible for creating legal frameworks and employee incentives, financial support. The public is involved, from co-workers to transport workers to the media. We're all, it involves creating an inclusive culture, involves all of us. And I really feel it's so wonderful that this conference brings together all of these groups so that we can come up with great solutions. And I think before we open up the questions, I'll just remind everybody that you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. As well, if that's not working for you, you can also ask questions in the chat box. But before we open up to the public, or while people are kind of gathering their thoughts, I don't know if any of the panelists want to ask questions of each other or make comments about each other's presentations. Okay, so everybody's here. Helen, Chloe, Christine, do you have any comments or questions about the panel and about the things we've talked about today? Oh, okay. I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Andrea.
I got us started.
Get us started.
Christine, I really, both Chloe and I, when we first met, so we had a little meeting before the presentation, just a couple of weeks ago, just to talk about our panel. And at that time, Christine shared with us the terminology around people in disabling situations. And both Chloe and I were really, really felt that that was an excellent term to use, because it's something that we've actually spoken to many of our participants about, sort of how do you prefer for us to refer to you and your disability? And so I feel like in general, people are very kind and respectful, and they want to use terminology that others won't find offensive, or that will be really a good way to address each other. So how did you come up with, or what was your process in trying, gathering these terms for employers to be able to use and to feel confident that they are using the best terms?
I think it's a good question. The work we do at CRISPECH is really to foster inclusion. And we found that when we work with employers and in different areas, they have a hard time making this distinction between integration and inclusion. And there are two different paradigms. So that's where we started the work. So if we're working on integrating people, we have to sort of accommodate. Goes back to what Helen was presenting. We have to put accommodation measures in place, which is super important to bring equity in the workplace. But we can think also differently, because inclusion is offering a different paradigm where you really want to make sure you minimize the obstacles in the environment at all levels, whether it's communication, the physical environment, the attitudes, it's on so many layers. If you integrate, then you see the person as holding the disability and being responsible for the disability. And what we're trying to convey with this inclusion paradigm and really trying to help the employers distinguish the two approaches, because they're not the same. And we're not saying, we're fostering, we want to put forward that inclusion is the best measure, for people in disabling situations, because then it's a shared responsibility. That's the idea behind that terminology. And if we stick to the inclusion side of the paradigm and we're working a little less on integration, we want to make sure that people are welcome as they are with their particularities and characteristics, because we all have some. So we're sort of like going away from a norm that doesn't exist anyway. And we're really trying to say, hey, your workforce is diverse. And it's, yes, sometimes people are having a persistent disabling situation, but you have to think differently in terms of how can the employer diminish the obstacles in the environment at all level as much as possible. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Christine. That was very articulate. And I don't know if anyone had questions that we can move on to. We do have one question in the chat that we can move on to. Did anyone else want to make a comment about that? Inclusive language and terminology?
I'd like to. I have to say, Christine, I've been thinking, as someone with a disability, I actually like disabled person because it implies that the environment disables the person, but it's the first time when we met with you the other day when it's personne en situation du handicap, really for me captured for the first time that sense that it is the context that is disabling, that we all have traits and we may be disabled depending on what your traits are by that context. And I really, really liked it. And I'm hoping, actually, I'm going to steal it. I'm not steal it, but I want to use it.
Yes, it's for everyone.
Yes, I really like that sense of, you're right, that we're all in that context. We're all participating in it. So yeah, I really appreciated that.
So I will read out the question that's in the chat for those who might not be able to access the chat. So from Anthony Smith, we have a question that says, the pandemic opened doors as employers shifted to remote work, but when the doors reopened, the language of job postings changed to include in-person or not remotely accessible employment. Those that benefited from remote work as a disability accommodation found themselves again on the outside. So this is kind of a comment, but did any of the panelists want to address this?
I could say, one thing I think working in the federal government, and as you may know, most of us are still working from home. And from the perspective of accommodations, I've heard that there are benefits and then there are drawbacks. Of course, these things occur on a situational case-by-case basis, right? So, but absolutely, I think the concept of using working from home or working at home as an accommodation is still something that people struggle with, and employers struggle with that. And I personally can attest to this because years ago I asked for accommodation to work from home as an accommodation, and it wasn't granted, and it was said it's not an accommodation. Working from home is not an accommodation. So I think there is still that struggle with employers to accept the fact that people work differently and people need different ways of working, and that it's okay and it's not threatening to the work they do, and in fact it's beneficial to the work they do. And again, I think many people will agree that working from home has been a very great way to work for a lot of people with and without disabilities. So I'm sorry to hear that it's not as welcoming in some environments now that you've gone back to work.
So we have a question that's, thanks for taking that question, Helen. We have a question that someone had raised their hand. Janet Patterson, did you want to just unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. My question actually is, so I have workplace injury and permanent injury from it. And I have found my employer, they're willing to provide the tools, but they don't want to. So it's a long story, but I went from a full-time position and my workplace was told they only had to give me 5 hours a week. So I've tried to open doors to get other employment and like within the organization, because I've been there 25 years, and they just say, oh, you'd be excellent for the job, but we don't have to hire you. So it's kind of like I've often wondered, because I do have a strong skill set. Sustainability is part of my challenge for me. I don't understand how do I open the door about that? Is it like I've sometimes wondered, because the organization supports people with disabilities and injuries, and they've terminated me from positions because they said, look, you can't even walk right now. So I mean, they obviously have to realize what's going on with me, but I don't know. Like twice I've applied, and both times they just says, oh no, you would have been great, you're but we just don't have to hire you. So is there, do you have any suggestions for that at all?
I'll try this a bit. I think really you need a lawyer. I hate to say it, but you need someone to advise you more clearly about what your rights are within your particular situation, because they get, I mean, I have no idea whether it's a union environment or what their contracts, but there are all sorts of things, and you're going to need someone who can parse that for you. It would seem from your description that in fact you are somehow not, in a sense, achieving what you should be in terms of, or experiencing your full integration or rights in that situation. But it's hard to know, because I think you really need to have someone who understands the context, the fine details.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a question that's in the Q&A box here. I'll read it out. It's from Margaret Oldfield. And she says, thinking about intersectionality, how can we measure, or how can the measures we envision for creating workplaces that are inclusive for disabled people be applied to creating inclusive workplaces for people from other marginalized groups? And so I think Christine was going to address this.
Yes, it's a particular interest of mine. I think it's a question of the hour in some places. So intersectionality. So when we think about different identity, I'm going to try to translate my brain because I usually work on this in French. So when we talk about different identity markers, we tend to forget that we all are containing different identities within ourselves. And I think that one of the things we're sort of like trying to foster in organizations we're working with in terms of EDI practices and inclusion of people with in disabling situations, or people from minorized groups, is that inclusion is a posture. It starts with, it doesn't start with a how-to, it starts also with a why. So my internal posture as an employer for inclusion should embrace all diversity. So if I'm going to be inclusive and think in terms of access and equity, and equity as a measure for eventual equality, sorry, with my English. So if we're thinking in terms of equality as being the ideal outcome, inclusion is both a practice and an ideal. We're working towards that ideal. We want to put measure of equity in place to sustain an eventual equality. And so in my sense, when we work with an inclusive posture, we should address the variety of diversity. And this is why when we talk about people being in a disabling situation, we want to be careful on how we label things, because not everyone identifies first as a person in a disabling situation. Some people feel a stronger sense of religious identity or cultural identity, or they have different ways of describing themselves, and they wouldn't say first, oh yes, I'm a person in a disabling situation. So we have to be careful not to prioritize their identity for them when we work as being inclusive in the workplace. And so I think employers, when Chloe, you were talking about the importance of embodiment at the top level of an organization in terms of inclusion, right? That was part of your presentation. I think it's something that, yes, it's everywhere. And if you want to foster inclusion for all diversity and intersectionality perspective, then it works for everyone. Everyone should be welcome as they are. That's basically what inclusion is also all about. So how can we work with the diversity is a different question. But if you have a lens where nobody has to fit to a certain, I was referring earlier to a certain norm, because norm doesn't exist in 2021, because we all have specific characteristics. And we have, I like to use this constellation of identity markers, you know? So we pile up different layers of our identities, and that makes up who we are. So there is no homogeneity, and a group is not, it's just comprised of different people. So
that's a really great point, Christine. You make so many good points. I think Chloe wanted to add to that. We have about 2 minutes left. Just before Chloe answers or comments, an anonymous attendee did make also the comment that very few younger people identify with the disability identity as well. But Chloe, did you want to add to that talk around intersectionality?
I was just saying that I'm just expanding on what Christine has said. I mean, you and I, Andrea, around our sort of research table have talked about how everybody has traits, and wouldn't it be great if when you get employed or when you have sort of these meetings with HR, they say to you, okay, what do you need to be your best, most productive self in this job? And maybe you are a young mother who needs to get home for the daycare, or maybe you're somebody who actually has their evenings off, but has an elderly parent they have to see on the weekends, so you can stay late in the evenings, but you cannot do weekend work. So there are things that if we could sort of just see these traits as being part of who we are and our different identities, then I think that might be helpful. And I also think that I'm ableist, I'm disabled, but I recognize I'm ableist. I've been raised in an ableist environment. It's in me. I have kids of color. I'm the only white person in my family, but I'm still racist. That's where I was raised. So at some level, if you start to realize that you're part of the solution, even if you don't necessarily have that minority identity, I think that helps too, without feeling guilty. That's the whole point. I mean,
Helen, did you want to add anything? We have about 1 minute left, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the comment about young people not identifying with the disability. And that's important because I think we rely a lot on people coming forward to identify as having a disability for them to get services. And so if they're not going to be doing that, then we need to be proactive to determine how do we get services, how do we create an inclusive, accommodating environment without them having to say, hey, I have a disability. So that's the idea of using a more inclusive and accessible a path right from the beginning. And I was really happy to hear this past week from somebody I was speaking to in the HR community that they're like, look, we're going to start asking candidates or job applicants who have to take an assessment, what's going to work for you? What kind of format will work for you? Will it be an interview, or is it better if we do it in writing? Or is it better if we do this type of format? And that is, in the federal government and probably in some other large corporations, is a pretty interesting shift, because we're so used to fitting people into these molds of, no, this is how we're doing it. We're having an interview, a written test, we're doing it this way. And if you can't fit into that mold, well, you'll be screened out. And so I'm really glad to hear that we're moving even further towards the inclusive design idea, where we're going to here's what would work for you, the same as what Chloe was saying. What would work for you to be included at work? What would work for you to be included even before that, to get into the selection process? So that's I'm really happy to hear that's the way the conversation's going.
So what a rich, important discussion. I want to thank all the presenters and the many people attending who've raised such important issues. And I think where we've come to is it's a pretty deep challenge that we face, but inclusion for all types of people, all types of needs, is such a vital priority, and we really want to make sure that goes forward. We hope you come back Monday and Tuesday. Monday's about the supports for persons with disabilities. We've got a tremendous range of discussions of supports. And then on Tuesday, we're really hoping that we have a good turnout, that you all come back, even more people come. And the objective of Tuesday is that we figure out a really good way forward so these ideas can be brought into action.